and the European Union.
Is your speak. Thank you very much, and good morning, should I say, to everybody, particularly those who met already in Bali, in Indonesia. I might bring up some points you already heard from me at the time in Indonesia, so there's some repetition in this context. I want to bring it into context with the G20, as Professor Köchler already mentioned. G20 has a lot of problems, and I agree with some of these problems which were already presented. Can I put myself? Yeah. Yeah, okay. So the G20 is seen with the rise of Asia now. That's the conference title we have here. And I just want to demonstrate, it looks as if the USA is still up on the hill here in this picture. It's just the opposite. If you look to the right here, you see that China already in PPP has advanced over the United States in GDP terms at least. And this is a clear signal now that tendencies are very obvious here. And I dare say the rise of Asia is particularly the return of China. Not the rise of Asia, but it's a return. Because if you look to the left side of this slide here, you see clearly that China has been already clearly stronger in terms of economic power than the West at that time. And the tendency is very obvious now that China has been clearly re-emerging into the economic power of the world.
The next slide. Yeah. But looking at G20, as it was already, maybe you have to move it a little down. This one? Oh, this one? Move it down. Okay. Yeah, okay. The G20 is supposed to be some kind of informal representation of the nations of this globe. But I have problems there. One thing is very difficult to define what is a nation. It's more or less defined by the membership in the UN. That's why it's called the United Nations. All those members of the UN are supposed to be nations. But look at the problem of Taiwan, Palestine, and others. The issue of the nation as such is, even in international law, very difficult to define clearly what is a nation. It's more or less the United Nations as such, with its consensus, not even majority, deciding what is a nation. And that's why I say if it would be really representative for the global governance, it should be representing peoples, or even people without an S. That means all different individuals in this world should be represented in the United Nations global governance. And that would be the best way to reach some kind of consensus at global level. It's very difficult to do that in democratic terms. If you add up all the people in this world to decide on certain issues would be very difficult. And I'm idealist in that way. We need consensus at global level because there is no planet B, as Greta Thunberg very clearly says. If we have only a majority against a minority at global governance democracy, we would always have some dissent, and these people would say we are not part of it. So we need consensus at global level, which is very difficult to do. And I think we should go beyond what is called the voting system of representation in quantitative terms and find more qualitative terms, which I would say should be from votes, which are quantitative, to voices, convincing voices. And there I would include particular civil society should have much more of a voice in deciding what's going on. We see a little bit of tendency, and I'll go more into details later, with, for instance, the process of COP, the conventions of parties coming together on the climate change issues, most recently in Egypt. Next will be coming up again at the end of this year. And here we see more and more that civil society expertise and knowledge is more influencing what is in the end formally still being decided by the national diplomats. In the case of the COP process, it's 195 at least was in Egypt recently, who decide formally, but it's civil society having more and more of an influence there. And I think this expertise of civil society should have much more an impact, not only at global level, already at regional and even national level, to be really the best and efficient and effective, accountable and responsible governance system. We see here on this picture as well that the South, particularly Africa, is hardly represented in the G20. You see only South Africa and Saudi Arabia there at the corner, but which is not really Africa anyway. So Africa is very poorly represented in G20. And it was already clearly made out by Professor Köchler that Europe is highly represented, but I would dare say North America is even more represented, because all countries of what is called NAFTA still, all three, Canada, Mexico, and the USA, are represented in G20. Europe is overrepresented in so far because the EU as such, representing the 27 members of the EU, are there as the 20th member, the EU as such. But I have to disagree with Professor Köchler when he compares the EU to ASEAN, Mercosur, and other interregional, regional organizations, because the difference with the EU is very clearly that the EU has what we call supranational competences, which is not given, particularly not with ASEAN, with African Union and other regional bodies. And this difference is very clearly in law, that there is a possibility for the EU to speak on behalf of all of them with its own competences, particularly in issues of trade, of course, economy, and to a certain degree in financial issues as well. So there's a difference here to be made with a different intergovernmental, as you call them, bodies and the EU. They are not the same. Can we have the next picture, please? So what I explain here is that the informal global governance is the G20, which was more or less trying to come out of G7. G7 was early, very clearly, only the industrial countries of the West, including Japan at the time. So it was very much Western oriented, not only dominated, very monopolized as some kind of a club, informal club was a G7 at the time. And in order to claim some kind of representativity over the world, it was then enlarged to bring in the global South to a certain degree and bringing in emergent economies that made up the G20, particularly India, of course, Indonesia, China were included then to become G20. But for me, this is not representative at all, because it's still very much based on nations which very unequally are represented. Even in the United Nations, and there I have some problems again with my neighbor here, the nations are not at all equal. I have some problems there because if you compare, for instance, China with Naruto in the Pacific, the population already of China is 145,000 times of the smallest nation in the Pacific. But they both have one vote, one quantitative vote in the General Assembly of the United Nations. This cannot be seen as equal representation of people. So there are differences between the informal group of 7 and G20, as well as the United Nations, which is still seen as the only global governance in formal terms. And of course, you have all the other organizations along with the United Nations, sub-organizations of the UN as such. Next, please. So what is supranational? Supranational understanding is very much based on the European process, and we have to be aware that the EU came up with this idea of supranationality because we saw wars between nations over hundreds of years, particularly between France and Germany. The last 100 years between France and Germany, we had 4 really drastic wars, not only the world wars, but before that already. And it's very interesting, if you look at the borders, for instance, of France and Germany, how they moved with each war. It was in the end, the military generals who decided where the national border was. It has nothing to do with natural borders anymore. Even the Rhine River was chosen as a border sometimes, but it was moved from one side to the other. The extreme case, some people here in France might remember the Alsace or Elsace, which is still now being in between in a way. And I call the most European core of the union here in the history. But
anyway, Strasbourg is the parliament.
Strasbourg, that's why there's a parliament.
Yeah.
At least part of the sessions of the European Parliament are in Strasbourg. That's exact, yeah. So this is going back to what we call the Westphalian system of the nation. The Peace of Westphalia in 1648 was very clearly in setting up national identities according to the religion. It was a fight between Catholics and Protestants at the time, to put it very simply. And the division was done. The region belonging to the king was defined by the religion of the king and it's the people following him in his religion. So the regio and the religio, as I say in Latin, was very much decided with the identity of the nation. And this nowadays should not be the case anymore, because this is not true. We have all kinds of religion in all different places, and they should live together without any national differences here. So if you look at the second step here, the region beyond the nation, there we have the difference, as I mentioned already, between the EU and the other so-called intergovernmental regional bodies like ASEAN, African Union, NAFTA, Mercosur, and so far. This is quite different at the regional level. That's why I say the EU, with its what we call pooling of sovereignty of national competences coming together in one body, this is some kind of a stepping stone towards more global governance. And here I use the term now omnilateral instead of only multilateral. Multi meaning many, omnibus meaning for all and by all, to go beyond the nation and bringing together people and peoples in order to have some kind of common denominator and being able to really find consensus on global issues like climate change and even against war. So this is the next step. After the regionalization, we need some kind of excuse me, omnilateralization in this context here. Next, please. So we see the problem of the sovereignty of the nation, which came out of the Peace of Westphalia, 1648, being more and more an illusion, actually. It's not only that the economies of the world have come together in the so-called globalization, it's as well that there's much more communication than ever. Look at the internet. We all got our phones, smartphones in the pocket to link over borders. There's no national limit anymore in communication. And we see here more and more there's this kind of a tendency is very much beyond what Thomas Hobbes at the time called the anachronism and the problem of the sorry, I'm now getting a little bit lost with my Greek here. The anarchy of the Thomas Hobbes understanding of the world. If there's no international relation, if there's no agreement at all, we would have anarchy between the different, what we call nations. And to overcome wars and national identities, I think we need this kind of overcoming the sovereignty, particularly this absoluteness of sovereignty of the nation. This in the long term is the only way to find common global governance and find a consensus to deal with our global problems like climate change in particular. And we see as well a loss of this sovereignty if you go down below the national level. Even there we have, in the UK context, we call it devolution. In other places, you call it subsidiarity, that things should be done at the level, at the local level if possible. And only if that cannot be solved, like climate change, you cannot solve in a single village, for instance, you have to go to a higher level. And this is, in the end, the global level to deal with climate change, for instance. Next, please. Yeah, I can't see the title.
But there you see. This is
just to give you a very hard example, I used it already in Indonesia, it's a pandemic, because it was very clear that if you don't have this kind of communication from the local level of governance to the highest level, in the case of, for instance, health issues, you can have enormous damage to the world. Even millions of deaths could have been avoided if there was a direct wire, a direct communication from Wuhan to Geneva. This is established now as an historic fact that there was in Taipei from Wuhan coming an airplane, and they realized there was some problem with some unknown virus on this airplane. The authorities in Taipei proved that and sent an email to Geneva, to the WHO. But unfortunately, since Taiwan is not a member, it's not a nation officially, it was not accepted by the WHO at the time. Just 2 or 3 weeks earlier, having declared this pandemic would have had an enormous impact. It would have reduced probably millions of deaths and even trillions of dollars or euros in damage to the economy. It's very clear there's a historic fact now about that we need direct communication from the lowest level of governance, that's the local level, to the highest global level, because we are so interdependent in our not only economies, but in our understanding of the world, that we have to have this direct communication, and there shouldn't be any bottleneck. This sovereign bottleneck of the nation is really the problem here. This could have been avoided, these damages in economic as well as in even people's lives, if we had a direct communication already at that time. Next, please. So there is a clear issue here, and it's not only the economists that says there are more than 10 million deaths actually from the pandemic, and it's still going on to a certain degree. Of course, it's changing now. Maybe it's only seen as an endemic from now on, but nevertheless, it was obvious that the damage by the pandemic was enormous. And people say it has not been as bad for hundreds of years so far, but it was preventable even. That's the issue. We could have prevented it if there were direct communication possibilities from local governance to global governance. And this direct communication and direct possibility, I think, is a big issue, because the nation still is a bottleneck of our governance, whereas we are living together, and people coming here from Indonesia, from all over the world, shows that we are together in one place here, and we easily could have, again, we are not wearing masks, for instance. We could have, again, an issue like that in the near future, and there we should be aware that this should be possible to have clear indications where to start already, what is a pandemic, as early as possible, and to avoid this national sovereignty as being a bottleneck for this communication. Thank you. Next. It's not only with this issue of welfare that we need through-going transparent information from the local to the highest level. Even the problem of the, I dare say, NATO failing in Afghanistan with its approach there is very obviously a case where the nation is misunderstood. And I go as far as saying that there is no tradition in Asia, for instance, or Africa, Latin America, of the idea of the nation. It's very much a European concept, which was through colonization and even through decolonization, actually creating this illusion of the nation, the absolute illusion of the nation and the borders of the nation. And I dare say here that even in the case of Afghanistan would have been seen differently if the NATO and US military would have understood that the nation in Asia is not as clear as we have in our illusion in Europe still. Next, please. So it's very simple to say all the way from welfare to warfare, the nation as such is a problem. And in order to avoid, and I go as far as saying even the issue with Ukraine has to do with this understanding of the nation still. But we could avoid a lot of problems in the world if we wouldn't see the nation as being the absolute identity, the absolute reference point for our politics at higher level, at global level, because no nation is absolutely sovereign anywhere. And I go as far as saying even North Korea is not completely independent from the world. They depend very much not only on China, but even on international help in other aspects. So the governance system from local to global acts at various levels, and they have to be as communicative as possible to mention again the pandemic as an extreme example for this through-going need for information. Next, please. And to make clear that, as we understand now, so-called international relations, there is this issue of, for instance, it was mentioned before as well, the unilateralism that the hegemon, still seen as the US as such, is doing a unilateral approach. And of course, Trump is seen very much as the incorporation of unilateralism here. But we have bilateral treaties, which are very often FTAs, free trade agreements. And even there is already a problem because it's never clear if there's an equality between the two partners of the agreement. If you have, for instance, the EU together with a small country, even most recently with Vietnam, there's an FTA negotiated by the EU. They are not equal partners in a negotiation. And it's very difficult here again to find equality of nations. Nations are very unequal. There's, of course, a trilateral, which is famous in East Asia, China, Japan, Korea. We have plurilateral, which is hardly known. That's particular within the WTO. It's used as a smaller group of countries coming together. And then we have the multi-level, which is very often viewed as a term. It's very hackneyed as a term already, but actually it's very used to the nation. It's only referring to nations. That's why I want to introduce this idea of omnilateral, which is beyond the nation, bringing in other actors, non-state actors into the global governance system, in particular with issues of global relevance. And here I go back to Immanuel Kant, the German philosopher, Prussian philosopher, I should say, where he used the term allseitig, which is translated into omnilateral then in other languages. Next, please.
Still long? Yeah.
Time-wise, I'm running out of time. Okay.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. I just want to mention here that the understanding of international law is very much based on European or Western law ideas, and it goes back actually to Hugo Grotius, a Dutch lawyer, who explained that. And it was in Asia actually where he decided between Indonesia, or at the time the East Indies, between the Spanish, Portuguese, and the Dutch, showing that there's free movement on the sea, but on territories, it's clearly there are borders dominated by different parts of the colonial powers here. That was a start actually of international law. Maybe go to the last and it's easier. These are just demonstrations here. This is quite interesting. Can I just, yeah. This is very interesting here. If you look at most recent, and this is the most recent survey on the trust of the people in their different actors at the governance level. It's the civil societies, the NGOs, who have much more trust than governments and even more than business and the media. This is very interesting, and it's a tendency that's getting stronger and stronger. And I think the problem we have seen with COP in Egypt recently again shows very clearly that this influence should be not only informal, and I remember there were groups outside the kind of campus of the discussion, which were not allowed into the campus to discuss with the national diplomats in Egypt at the time. I think they should be much more involved in officially deciding about what's happening at global level and the decision making. And this is as well, and maybe go back up one. Yeah, and it's as well the Guterres, the Secretary General of the United Nations, who himself says that the civil society and NGOs should be much more involved, not only in decision shaping, but decision making of the United Nations. And I think this is a tendency which has to become stronger, which I call omnilateral. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.